same time, those numbers can potentially be relative. And if you're not really familiar with not necessarily the space, but publishing as a whole, that could mislead you a little bit where, wow, 30,000, that's a lot of money. But then really understanding it might not be a lot of money for everything that you may need for your project. So I'm glad you emphasized that point too, because again, these numbers can be really relative to people. And when it's your first time getting approached by a publisher and stuff, it can be really exciting and easily any rational sense can potentially go out the window.
Yeah, and and that's not. And I do want to say there is a scale to games, of course. So I'm not saying something it's always going to be an unreasonable amount that shouldn't be considered that amount. I mean, it can depend on the scale. I mean, we've tended to work with games. I mean, our games are indie games, but they're on the larger size for indie games, both Terra Invicta and Alliance of Sacred Sons. So development funding for them is a couple $100,000 or something reasonable for them. But there are indie games to which something like $30,000 might be a reasonable amount of development funding. If it's not like years of development, but it's a shorter game to develop, it doesn't have as much cost. I'm not saying that's blanket unreasonable.
Right.
It wouldn't be the thing that would cause. You should never sort of get starry-eyed just because there's money being put on the table. You really want to dig into what the publisher has done in the past.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. Now, I want to kind of take this overall topic that we led in with and dive in a little bit further with it in terms of the current publishing landscape. So what is that like now? And how are there any particular warning signs that devs should look out for if and when they're being approached by any publishers?
So, the thing is I end up collecting a lot of sort of stories because I hear a lot of pitches, and and most of them I have to pass on for various reasons. There often isn't anything wrong with the game. It's just it doesn't fit into the release time they want to do. We can't do that time, or doesn't fit with games and such. But I end up basically staying friends with so far with pretty much everyone I've talked to, and we end up having a sort of continuing dialogue. So devs will come back to me and talk to me about other publishers they're talking to, and ask me what I think of what they're hearing and such. So I do end up collecting a lot of stories from devs about what's going on. So I do have, and of course, I'm not going to name any names of other publishers here, but
right.
I have seen a lot of approaches that I think are sort of questionable. For instance, there are publishers. I've heard of a publisher, for example, taking one example. One developer I've talked to, they're getting emails from a publisher that's basically telling them, you're never going to, you need us. You're never going to succeed on Steam with this amount of, wish list you have, and you got to go with us, and then we'll make you visible, all this. But I told the dev to look into them. This is what I tell everyone to do: is go to that publisher's past releases on Steam and upcoming releases and see what's going on with them. And it turned out that publisher had exactly one other release, happened to be in the same genre as the developer they were contacting, and it had 20% as many wish lists as judged by estimate from the followers. So basically they're emailing saying, look, you need us because you're so small, you're never going to get noticed. And they got another game that they've been doing nothing for, really, in comparison. If that's true, it's even more true for the game that they let down then, because it doesn't have even as many wish lists as the one they're emailing. So I think what you end up with is a lot of publishers, there's a lot of small companies trying to be publishers, and that's great in a way. But sometimes there's people who try to represent themselves as the golden keys who aren't quite there yet. And you want to look for someone who's honest with you and sort of talks to you about your game, and not someone who's, I think, right away telling you why you desperately need them and you're not going to succeed without them. I would be worried about anyone who's approaching from that perspective.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's not really. I mean, sometimes I wonder myself why people would approach things that way, but obviously they do. But at the end of the day, it doesn't come off as being very genuine in terms of, or at least not just that, but also open up to a communication. And like you said, an important aspect too is if they show interest in the game outside of hey, we're willing to help you, but do they show anything else beyond that? Did they call out to something in the game? I mean, just a little something extra that could showcase that they care about the project, not just at the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I am really sort of like everyone, the thing to realize is that everyone's being a salesman. Everyone who talks to you is going to take one of many approaches. They might play off your fears, or they might try to
Mm.
be your best. They might tell you how they're different than all the other publishers and they'll look out for you, or they might just like dangle hopes in front of you for like what you could achieve and how great things could be. But ultimately, everyone's being a salesman. And what you got to sort of just the base assumption has to be that the publisher, that you're not like the special true love of the publisher and they're going to do more for you than they did for anyone else. So what I would advocate doing is if you're looking at a publisher, the first thing you do is you look at their other games. And now, if they've got past releases that are out, look at the number of reviews on those games. And you can do a simple calculation, which I'm sure you talked about here on the podcast, to estimate it. You can go to SteamDB, but basically look about the likely sales that their other games have had. And if they don't have games out, which is I think I'd say is fine because I'm a publisher that's still we're new and we've got 2 upcoming games. But then I'd say judge them by their wish list numbers. And you can estimate those by looking at follower counts. You can go into the top wish list to see where they rank. Either way, though, you need to judge them based on what they're doing for other games, and don't assume that you're different. I've actually heard this because there was one I was talking to a different dev, and the publisher that was talking to him was just telling him all sorts of represents that as the biggest thing, all sorts of promises, and like their past. They had one released game and it had like 20 reviews out there. And I'm not saying a game with 20 reviews is bad, but it does not match what that publisher was telling that developer they were going to be able to do for them, which is just like, we're going to make you rich and you're going to be the biggest game and everything. And, and that's the thing is you just figure that they're going to do for you what they've done for other games.
Yeah. That's a good way to look at it for sure. So just look up their past history, see what else they've been able to help out. And another thing too is don't feel, if someone's approaching you, don't feel bad about reaching out to maybe those developers too to get maybe a firsthand experience as well.
Yeah, that actually gets into a problem. I mean, I know we're probably going to chat about contracts later, but one thing that's disturbingly common is to have non-disparagement clauses in contracts, where the developer is contractually mandated to never say anything negative about the publisher. Now, we don't put those in our contracts. So because I think there's just a basic, well, first of all, I think there's a moral principle there. And second is, I don't know, I wouldn't trust if someone isn't going to let people who had a bad experience talk about it. I mean, the job of the publisher would be to make sure their developers have good experiences and want to talk about them, not have a contractual provision to prevent it. But that is incredibly common. In fact, of the publisher contracts that I've seen so far, I've yet to I don't remember seeing one that didn't put a non-disparagement clause, and really that should change. That shouldn't be part of contracts.
Yeah, and maybe too if it isn't a situation where they reach out and they're like, "I'm not supposed to say," or "Oh, it's okay, it's great," and there's no other information, like that could be an indicator that might be the situation for that developer.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the thing is that like if they're not willing to say anything or if they seem kind of guarded, you can sort of read into that. I agree with that.
Yeah. Well, speaking about this, and you mentioned it earlier about in terms of like small publishers and stuff, I'm curious, can the size of a publisher matter in terms of what indie devs may be looking for, or more importantly, what they need?
Yeah, here's, in looking at that, I think that I think it can, but it's going to just vary so much in terms of what that publisher does and what the implication that size are. So to take some examples, I think that although a lot of publishers will talk about like their reach and, the past gamers they have, I think that's actually true of very few publishers. And, I think there's very few publishers that like people will buy their game just because it's one of that publisher's games. Now, those publishers, and I mean, we probably could name who they are because people do trust them. I mean, frankly, a game that is published by Paradox will instantly have a huge audience. Now, it's just absolutely true for them. That having been said, it's really not true for almost, there are just count them on 10 probably across the industry who have that kind of status with players.
Right.
They might have status with people in the industry. They might have relations with media and such, but that players actually look to a standard of play. So I would go ahead. I would never assume that just because a publisher has a lot of has been around a lot that's going to have really any reach. That having been said, some things can help in that. If a publisher is focused on your genres, I think that really helps. And so, because players will come to recognize that. And I guess we go back to the Paradox example. I mean, Paradox is a very good example of that. They're recognized for certain kinds of games and loved by the people who love those games. And I think that helps in that. If a publisher becomes too broad and it's sort of every kind of game, I think that even if they're rather big, it's very unlikely they're going to end up having that kind of loyalty where they bring draw just from that. That's one of the reasons why with Hooded Horse we're going rather narrow in a way, and everything focused on strategy. So I wouldn't think, outside of a few exceptions, that the publisher itself is going to do much by being the publisher. What they're going to do is mostly they're going to do things actively to help you. And in that sense, whether they're big or small is probably less important than how active they are for the games they're doing. And you can kind of see this because, the best way to judge it is ultimately results. I mean, You can look at how games are performing on Steam DB and such. You can see their other games and whether they're actively doing things for them. You can also see what they do when games are sort of like struggling a bit. I think one way to judge a publisher is, there are publishers out there who sort of, big and small, who seem more inclined to just sort of like let a game be out there. And if it succeeds, maybe they'll do something for them. But it's all sort of like, if not, well, then they're just kind of cut their losses and be done with them. That's less, I think, encouraging than a publisher who looks like they're going to try to support the game. And they're going to try to do whatever they can for all their games. And I think that's another thing you want. So I would try to... Yeah, and these things are sort of get independent. I know you asked about size. They sort of work differently depending on the size, I think. But size itself would not be the concern for me. It's really how active are they in doing things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a better way to approach things, because I think sometimes it's this well-known publisher and everything else, where if that opportunity happens for some indie devs and let's say, it's a well-recognized brand, that's a big deal. Whereas this other small publisher, I never heard of them before, right? But to your point, it shouldn't be like size that matters. It should be like, what's the activity? What is their focus? What is their goals when it comes to your project, or even just their portfolio? How diverse is their portfolio? Is it really focused? Those are the factors. And what is that relationship going to look like? Is it right up to release date and then done, or does it go beyond that? Because those are also very important things to matter. Yes, we know, or it's somewhat general, that the first week that your game goes on sale is going to make up for a big percentage of what your overall earnings are going to be for the year. But that doesn't mean there's not potential to still capitalize on that time frame. And if some people just drop it right after that time frame or whatever and don't do anything else with it, is that important to you, that they keep that partnership lasts beyond that? I would say anybody would probably say yes. So looking out for those types of things, I agree with you completely.
Yep, absolutely. And on that last point of sort of, especially with the area that we do, which is sort of strategy games, they have such potential for long-term sales if they're supported and expanded after release. So, one of the things that we talk to when I talk to developers is I talk to them about what their long-term plans are, because I basically want to make sure they're on board with that plan if the game does not stop at release, that this is a longer-term project. And I think from the other side, developers should talk to publishers about that, because it's, I know this directly because at least one developer has told me this. They got a bad feeling about a publisher because they said to the publisher, let's talk about what we're doing after release. And the publisher was explaining to them, it doesn't really matter. It's all about release. And then we're sort of done anyway. And, that's probably fine. And if there are certain games where that might be what the developer is looking for. And I'm not knocking that at all, because there are many different kinds of games. But if your kind of game is the kind where it does benefit from that long expansion and support after release, where release is really just the beginning, which strategy games are. And if you have that approach yourself, you want to find a publisher who is also looking for that kind of developer and that kind of approach, because that's what's going to lead to that long-term support.
So without backing up too much there too, I think an important thing that we're uncovering here is basically